Well, thank you, Rick, for that overly generous introduction. I'm delighted to see so many of you here. And those of you who have had me in class know that I like to keep things interactive. So let's start out and find the temperature of the group. I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change. And as Rick said, it's not the only thing that's going on in sustainability, as I know you all know. But as time is limited, we'll focus on that for this morning. But recognize, of course, that climate change is really only a symptom of the underlying situation, our unsustainable society at the moment. But let's find out how everybody thinks. So, a little bit of a straw poll. Which comes closest to your view? And please be honest here, we're not pushing an agenda. So pick one of the following. Until we're sure that climate change is really a problem, we should not do anything that would have any economic costs. Second choice, climate change should be addressed, but its effects will be gradual, so we can deal with it gradually by taking steps that are initially low in cost and more costly actions later if that proves to be necessary. Third choice, it's a serious and pressing problem, and we should take steps now, even if it involves significant costs. So how many for the first option? Are there any hands? It's a little hard. Okay, great. Yes, good. Thank you. How about for the second? I'm going to step out into the shadows. Second one. So very gradual, and we'll wait and see how things are going to be. And how about for the third one? Okay. Well, thank you for that. Let me tell you that you are not a typical audience. I am going to show you how people in this country and other countries think about this issue, and they are much more in the skeptical position than here, although even here we have some very sensible, well-educated, talented folks who have their concerns and think we should take it gradually. Well, so I am not here to talk particularly about how the climate works or what the evidence is. The debate about this is basically over, and I am here to show you, though, that we do now have definitive proof that climate change is happening and that it's real. So let's take a look at that. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong slide. This is the one we're looking at. And it shows carbon dioxide concentrations and the average global mean surface temperature for the past 400,000 years from the paleoclimate record. We can now go back even farther. And what you can see is we are now at about 385 parts per million, 387 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the principal greenhouse gas. That is far higher than it's been basically in the history of Homo sapiens on the planet. What is going to happen over the next century, which is a geological blink in the eye? Well, under business as usual projections, we're headed towards perhaps 850 parts per million. 550, which you can see here, is commonly cited as a fairly aggressive stabilization target. Basically, we're engaged in the largest uncontrolled experiment with our ecosystems that we've ever conducted. Now, I'm not here to debate the science. I think that debate is over. There's a strong scientific consensus that climate change is happening now, that it's primarily caused by anthropogenic human activity, and that it is business as usual is leading us on a trajectory that will lead to substantial increases in average temperatures, sea level rise, and a wide range of other impacts. What I want to talk about is what kind of a problem is this? How do people think about it? What are their mental models? What tools can we offer to help people think more clearly about it and come to positions and advocate for those positions that can get us onto a policy path that's going to be beneficial for everyone? And then how do we move past the delay, denial, and despair that are so prevalent today? One of the most prevalent mental models out there about climate change is that this is a technical issue. And a wide range of people, both scientists, politicians, and among the general public, say that what we need is another Manhattan Project. Well, you all know how the Manhattan Project worked. The smartest man in the world wrote a personal letter to the most powerful man in the world in 1939, pointing out recent developments in atomic physics. And as a result of that, and with enough money and genius in the deserts of New Mexico, in less than 6 years, we created nuclear weapons. An astoundingly successful technical program. You can see the appeal for the climate problem. It can't work that way for climate change. Why not? Well, think about how this worked. First of all, there was absolutely no role for the public. It had to be done in secret. The public couldn't understand it, and if they knew about it, it would compromise the program. It could be done only by technical elites, and the public didn't need to be involved in implementation. Climate change can't be addressed that way. Why? Well, in order for emissions to be reduced, everybody has to change the way they drive, the nature of the car they drive, the nature of the home that they hold, and how they heat that home, and how much they fly, and all the other activities completely encompassing everything we do in our society. So, how are we going to do this? Well, I think a much better analogy for the climate challenge is not the Manhattan Project, but the civil rights movement. So if you think about the civil rights movement, a couple of key attributes. First of all, leadership was distributed. It wasn't just Lyndon Johnson or Martin Luther King or even heroes like Rosa Parks. It was the thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people who stood up and spoke out against segregation in PTA meetings, in houses of worship, who marched in Selma in Washington, who went down and registered voters. And that created the pressure that ultimately led to the policy changes. So, and as you can see in this picture, Lyndon Johnson signing the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Climate challenge actually has the most difficult aspects of both the Manhattan Project situation and the civil rights movement. If we're going to create a sustainable world, if we're going to address these problems, we are going to need all the technical innovation and creativity we can muster. And you're going to hear about that in a little bit. But we also have to dramatically change the views and the beliefs and the actions of entire populations in this country and around the world. Public participation and public action in policymaking is essential here. Through your dollars and how you spend them, we affect the incentives that corporations face to go green, to address these issues. Through our votes and our political views, we are going to create the pressure on our leaders, of whichever party they may turn out to be, to take this seriously and to take action. The science alone is clearly not enough. That means leadership is distributed throughout all the major sectors of our society, government, business, and at the individual level. So what are some of the views that the public holds about this issue? Well, the good news is, in America and elsewhere in the world, with some exceptions, people now understand that climate change and global warming is real and that it's happening now. Very large majorities have heard of it, believe it's a critical or an important national threat, and believe that, for example, the United States should reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. However, we aren't willing to pay anything to do that. Very large majorities oppose any kind of taxes on energy that would internalize the environmental and other social externalities and put those true costs in front of you at the pump and in your electric bill. And of course, right now, given the economic situation, the number of people who are willing to do this is even less. Now, the usual interpretation of these kinds of results is that, well, what do you expect? Americans are selfish and short-sighted, and ignorant. And of course, they'll tell pollsters what they think pollsters want to hear, but secretly, they don't want to pay anything to solve these issues. When you dig a little bit deeper, what you find is there's something more basic going on, and you can see it here. The majority of people in our country, unlike this audience, think we can wait. Think we can wait and see whether it's going to turn out that climate change is for real. It already is, but they think we can wait. And whether it's going to actually be harmful to the economy, and if and only if that arises, then we should be able to take action. Now, instead of saying, well, people are just grossly ignorant of the science and we should therefore leave it in the hands of the experts, what I want to know is, what do people's view of the world have to be? What does their view of the world have to be in order for them to believe that waiting is a prudent response to the challenge? Well, wait and see would be prudent under certain conditions. There would have to be very short delays between our action in response to the challenge and the impact of those actions. So in particular, there would have to be short delays between the development of the scientific knowledge of the threat and public pressure to do something about it, then between that public pressure and actual changes in policy, then between those changes in policy and the actual reduction in emissions, then a short delay between the actual reduction in emissions and the reaction of the climate. And along the way, any damage that's incurred would have to be readily reversible. Absolutely none of these things are true. We know that there are very long delays in every link of that chain. It takes a long time to build the understanding. Now we are there now. But then there's an even longer delay to turn that into public awareness and pressure for action, policy change, emissions reductions, and once you've changed the emissions, very long delays in the reaction of the climate. Our research shows that this is a widespread difficulty, and it arises from very basic problems that people have in understanding even the most fundamental concepts of how the climate works. And you don't have to be a climatologist or have a PhD from MIT to understand the time delays here. And I've got to tell you, it's not merely a problem among the public. Oh yeah, go ahead. Thank you. It's not merely a problem among the general public. Among those who are negotiating under the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change, UNFCCC, attempting to negotiate binding agreements that would commit the parties to emissions trajectories, emissions reductions going forward in the post-Kyoto era, we have the similar problem. So I was speaking to the negotiator for Costa Rica recently, Cristiana Figueres, and here's what she had to say about that. The concrete environmental consequences of the various positions are not clear to us. There's a dangerous void of understanding about the short and long-term impacts. So what are we doing about that? Well, here at MIT, we have created, along with a group of our graduates, a group we call Climate Interactive, which is a coalition of business, non-governmental organizations, nonprofits, and academics who are creating interactive management flight simulators, such as the ones that Dave mentioned, to enable people to explore the dynamics of the climate and its impact on the economy for themselves, test all the assumptions, nothing hidden, everything open and transparent, so that people can discover these insights for themselves and then use those to inform their positions and the policies that they undertake. So let me show you one very quickly if I can. Now, this is, here we go. This is one that's actually available on the open web. You can find it on my website. It's a very simple one, and the ones we use with the negotiators for the upcoming negotiations that are taking place in Poznan in Poland this December, leading up to the Copenhagen round the following year, which is intended to produce the next agreement that will succeed Kyoto, are more complex. I don't have time to show those, but let's take a quick look at this one. What you see here is the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since 1900, and it has been rising, and we now stand at about 387 parts per million. In order to stabilize between, say, 400 and 450 and reach that goal right there, we need this kind of a pathway. 400, 450, 500 is generally considered not too risky, although Jim Hansen at NASA now believes, on the basis of the paleo record, that the only safe level for carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is 350 parts per million. And he's been proven right in the past, so we would ignore his advice at our peril. But let's be more conservative, or most people would say realistic, and see if we can stabilize at around 400 to 450. This shows emissions. The red curve is emissions of carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases since 1900, and they've been growing exponentially with the economy. And the green line is an estimate of the rate at which carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere as it is taken up by biomass through photosynthesis and as it dissolves in the oceans. And we've estimated that for you right here. And it's likely to saturate as the capacity of the biosphere to absorb that carbon is reached. This is the business as usual trajectory that IPCC projects. The question is, what should emissions do in order to reach this goal right here? So that's a question for you. I'll grab it and drag it here, but you tell me what it should do in order to stabilize emissions. So presumably they should fall. How much? Is that good? More, less, higher, a little lower? How about that? So I will cold call you if you don't answer. So what do you think? Lower? Lower? Stabilize right now today? No further growth? Lower. All right, well, let me tell you what most people do. Well, let's do what you want to do. Here? Yeah? Okay, how about that? Well, let's check it out. So we'll see what happened. And congratulations, you are a terrifically aware audience. Thank goodness for MIT's education. Now, let me tell you that that's not what most people do. What most people do is they say, look, we got to slow the growth and stabilize emissions, something like that. Look what happens, of course, to what's going on in the atmosphere. And they say, boy, that's going to be really hard. There's no way we can do that. But if we do that, the concentration in the atmosphere continues to grow. And it's obvious, and I think you all know why. We're pouring CO2 into the air much faster than it's being drained out. So in exactly the same way that if you pour water into your bathtub faster than it drains out, the level of water in the tub is going to continue to rise. Well, of course, in the real world, we don't control emissions this easily. So what do? Well, let's go to the next part of the simulation. Here, we have the same story. Now it runs from 2,000 to 2,100, and here's our goal. Let's see if we can keep it under 500. Only now we recognize that we can't directly control emissions. Instead, emissions are going to be growing as the population grows. 6.7 billion today, projected to reach 9 billion by 2050. As everyone in the world aspires to and is becoming richer and more affluent, energy consumption is going to rise, fossil fuel consumption is going to rise, and emissions are going to rise unless we dramatically change how we live. And the last part is how much CO2 is emitted per real dollar of economic activity. That's what we can change. So I've built in the official UN population forecasts. I've assumed that we continue to develop economically and that everyone continues to become more affluent at the same rate. And we've also built in some options about how the carbon cycle works. So are the carbon sinks going to saturate, or are we going to get in a situation where there are positive feedbacks that can actually reduce the absorption of carbon as those sinks saturate? Well, let's be modestly conservative and assume sink saturation here. And now there are delays. There are delays in adjusting the economy. Right now, nobody's willing to do anything in terms of binding commitments, so we'll put a long delay in there. And now let's see what happens. There's our goal. Let's see how we do. So we'll start acting now, and the economy is starting to react. And you see what's happening. We far overshoot our target. Well, I'm going to move on, but this kind of experience where you have a model that's carefully grounded in the best scientific understanding and the best models that are out there, but is interactive, and although we don't have time, you can go underneath and see all the assumptions. That is the kind of learning environment that's needed in order for people to discover the dynamics of the climate themselves. Well, I alluded to some of the saturation dynamics that can operate on the climate side, on the carbon cycle. Let me talk about that very briefly. People often say, well, listen, we don't really need to worry because what's going to happen is that as the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere increases, biomass is going to grow at a faster rate. Trees are going to grow faster, and that's going to suck that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere even faster, and so that's going to offset the increase. And in fact, that is a balancing or negative feedback loop, which is real. It is absolutely a real feedback loop. It's called CO2 fertilization. And you may know that experiments have been done in forestry research stations where they artificially elevate the carbon dioxide concentration in a patch of forest and monitor how much more quickly the plants grow. And they do grow faster, although not always the species that you're interested in. In fact, one of the plants that does best in elevated CO2 is poison ivy. There are, however, nonlinear constraints on this loop because other nutrients, sunlight, water, other micronutrients constrain the rate at which biomass can grow. The concern is that there are other feedbacks out there. For example, this reinforcing or positive feedback loop, where as the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere increases, the average surface temperature warms, and as that occurs, permafrost melts, and bacterial respiration in the forests of the world increases. And that mobilizes carbon that's been previously sequestered in the soils, and it's converted to carbon dioxide and methane, which is a powerful greenhouse gas, further increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and further increasing the temperatures, and around we go in a vicious cycle that is exactly analogous to what's been happening in the financial markets this week. Well, here is an example. This shows newly bioavailable carbon that is thawing out of previously frozen permafrost in, I believe this is from Siberia. That's about a 100-meter-high bank. There are many, many billion tons of carbon in these environments, boreal forests, tropical environments as well, that are being mobilized right now and accelerating climate change. Well, there are more. Wildfires, for example. As the average surface temperature increases, the length of the dry season is already growing. That increases the number and severity of the wildfires we experience. This has already been happening in the United States. We know about this from last year and this fall. That injects massive quantities of CO2 in the atmosphere, further warming the environment and increasing the incidence of fires still further. And that process is already happening, statistically significant increases in fire incidents in the western United States and elsewhere in the world. There are more. You're all familiar, I think, with the albedo effect. Average surface temperatures rise, so there's more melting and a reduction in snow and ice cover. That means that more of the incident sunlight is absorbed rather than reflected back to space, and as more energy is absorbed, it gets even warmer, even faster, and around we go in another vicious cycle. And you're probably all familiar with the data on the Arctic sea ice. Here you see NASA's animation over the past 20 years showing the reduction in the Arctic sea ice cover. It's falling at an accelerating rate, just like the reserves of our financial institutions. And although this only goes up to 2005, you know that last year was a record decline. This year the data are not quite in because September is usually the summer sea ice minimum in the Arctic, and we're waiting about a month for them to release the data. But right now we know that there's open ocean around there that's open to Northwest Passage. So in order to stabilize concentrations of greenhouse gases at anywhere close to a tolerable level, like 400, 450 parts per million, emissions must fall dramatically, on the order of 80% relative to a baseline year like 1990. That is highly counterintuitive for a lot of folks, but that's what has to happen. There's no scientific uncertainty about that. Now, this gets us to the second big myth, which is, hey, isn't that going to kill the economy? Isn't it going to be just too expensive, slow economic growth, cost jobs, and put our country, whichever country you're talking about, at a competitive disadvantage? Particularly with the state of the economy around the world today, this is a very powerful argument that really speaks to people's fears and xenophobic tendencies, the desire to blame other folks. Well, on the contrary, addressing this issue will pay dividends. For example, if we can cut our use of fossil fuels, it puts money in our pockets. Just consider the oil import situation. At only $90 a barrel, that's about $500 billion a year drag on the US economy. And if we can cut that, we also have other benefits, such as reducing our need to defend insecure supplies and reducing healthcare costs from the particulate matter, the black carbon, and the VOC, NOx and SOx, and so forth that are produced as we burn fossil fuels. That saves lives and saves money while improving our quality of life. And investing in emissions reduction stimulates innovation, creates new businesses, creates jobs that cannot be outsourced, and gives us the opportunity to be a leader in the global green and clean tech industries that are emerging, and it's getting cheaper every day. In fact, it's already so cheap that in many cases, addressing these problems has positive NPV and positive ROI and puts money in our pockets right now today. So this is a typical supply curve. This one happens to come from McKinsey, but there are many studies that show the same result. And what you can see is right here, there are tremendous opportunities to abate large quantities of carbon dioxide emissions that have positive economic return. And it's building efficiency and fuel efficiency in the commercial vehicle fleet and the private vehicle fleet, and improving water heating and air conditioning and lighting. And you're going to hear about this in a panel that Sarah Slaughter will moderate later today. These projects have positive NPV, positive ROI. They put money in your pocket, and an important question then is, why aren't they happening? Part of it is information failure, part of it is market failure, but there's much more going on. The organizational and institutional barriers, and you're going to hear in Rebecca Henderson's presentation much more about how organizations can step up, face these barriers, and overcome them. Let me show you one very simple example. This is the average primary efficiency of electricity generation in the United States, and since the Eisenhower administration, it has been stalled at about 33%. 2 out of every 3 joules that are used to generate electricity are wasted, and there's been no progress on that. What are we going to do about that? Well, we've got to go to new paradigms that capture that waste heat, and here's a variety of real projects that have been done by a variety of clean tech, green tech companies that have much higher efficiencies. Here's one example. This is the Middle Steel plant in Indiana. You can see the Chicago skyline across the lake there. This is a coke plant that makes the coke needed to make steel. And what they have done here is capture the waste heat from the coke ovens, and in this building it's used to make 97 megawatts of electricity at 0 incremental greenhouse emissions and at an average cost of 2.5 cents per kilowatt hour. That amount of energy is equal to the total amount of solar power, grid-tied solar power in 2005. And this is just one plant. And these kinds of plants have positive ROIs. They have negative abatement costs. Many people don't understand these opportunities, believe they can't exist, and I believe that those folks who say we can't address this problem, that it's going to be too expensive, that it's going to hurt the economy, have a profoundly pessimistic view about human creativity, about our capacity to work together and collectively for the greater good and for future generations. Here's how that's going to work out for us. The mental model people hold is that right now the demand for renewables and for efficiency is low because it ought to be low. And that's because the price of fossil fuels is very low compared to the high cost of the renewable energy and the efficiency investments. So there's only 2 ways you can get more renewables if you have this view. One is government subsidies, and the other is put a tax on carbon or cap emissions. Now, in fact, since the costs of carbon emissions are not currently priced, we have the world's largest market failure in the climate area. And we need to correct that market failure so that the price signals that people receive are the correct true costs of the energy that you use. And then markets can function. And, you know, as a professor in a school of management, I believe markets have an awful lot to offer here, but only if we were able to price the goods that we are able to consume at the appropriate level. But if this is your mental model, this is going to be a very expensive proposition. This omits the most important set of feedbacks that I'm going to show you today, and that is what happens as the production of these renewables increases. And we know it from biotech and from semiconductors and IT. We know that as the demand and the production and the scale improve, there's going to be greater R&D, more production experience and learning, field experience, economies of scale, public acceptance, institutional change that drive those costs down. We see it in every other area of our society. We're certainly seeing it in this area as well. That creates a reinforcing loop. A loop that says as we produce more, we learn more, the costs will fall, the price will fall, the demand will rise even further. That is the feedback loop that we need to drive. That is the feedback loop of human ingenuity, and that's what you're about to hear from our other 2 panelists. So let me introduce Professor Vladimir Bulovich here at MIT. Vlad is an associate professor, in the electrical engineering computer science department. He is one of the world's leading experts on organic optoelectronics and nanomaterials. And as you're about to hear, he is part of the group that is leading the development of the new technologies that are going to get us ultimately to the sustainable society to which we all aspire and that which we require. Vlad, welcome.
Thanks, John.
I'm going to use the buttons. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I am a scientist, and the funny thing about science these days, actually in the past decade, has been the recognition that actually you can't just be an electrical engineer like I am. You really have to understand physics and chemistry and material science in order to be able to fathom what lies ahead. The more recent phenomena in my field of endeavor is that it turns out we also need to understand economics, especially if we are trying to launch science or engineering projects that actually are meant to have large impacts. The specific things I would like to then talk about today is thinking about different ways of using photons. Photons that might be used to make light, like light bulbs, or maybe photons that sun provides us in order to go ahead and generate energy for a sustainable world. The picture, as you see it, is the planet that we know it, and that's actually all of us right there. So let's take a look at the nighttime sky and imagine, what is the output of the lights coming out? As a matter of fact, we don't have to imagine it much. The actual picture from satellites shows us that apparently no one lives in Africa. And a lot of people do live in the United States and Japan and Europe. In many ways, the other way of looking maybe at this picture is to emphasize where are the users of energy and also where the responsibility lies for developing better technologies. Indeed, if you actually look at the electricity consumption in the United States, just look at lighting. Artificial lighting consumes about 8% of US energy, 22% of US electricity. And the energy cost, well, here are the numbers. So I can ask, what do we spend that electricity on? Well, light bulbs, and there are different kinds. There are these incandescent light bulbs. Luckily, we are staying away from those as much as we can because they're fairly low efficiency. Fluorescents, they're doing better by about a factor of 4. Indeed, better penetration into the market, but we do have better technologies. We can go from these very low numbers to something like this, 35% power conversion in white LEDs. Well, as an electrical engineer, I look around and I say, well, my colleagues who build motors, they can make motors that have 85 to 90% power conversion efficiency. So why can't I make light bulbs that similarly perform? So looking at where can I go to address this question, the one thing that very quickly comes is the basic understanding of the very basic science down on a nanoscale. It turns out you can use molecules, quantum dots, these nano items you might have been hearing about in the press, to actually do make light bulbs. All that these little things are chunks of either stone, for example, in the case of nanocrystal quantum dots, that happen to have some amazing physical properties that, depending on their size, you can easily tune their color. And hence, if you choose to mix them up in a device, like we did last year, you should be able to actually make a white light device. This is a device that happens to have these little chunks of stone inserted in a thin film structure. Now, you're seeing here a very large picture of this particular thin film structure. Here it is in a macroscopic scale glowing, but its actual cross-section of this entire device, it's about 1/100th of a thickness of a human hair. The actual thing that glows right in the middle of this device, these quantum dots, they are 5 nanometers, 1,000 atoms. There are different ways of saying it, few molecular layers in thickness. The fact that we have a nanotechnology today to actually push us to these levels of understanding and manipulation of matter now opens a wide set of possibilities. Indeed, as you look at, for example, well, let's say TVs. If you look at TVs today, TVs consume about 1 to 2% of the US electricity. That's about one of these 3 gorgeous dams of electricity. So you can go ahead and take a look at different technologies and say, well, how do I evolve maybe from this thing that I might still have in my living room, or this thing that might be my LCD screen, to something that looks like this, a flexible, thin, very low power consuming device? The answer is actually we have it today. It's been launched December 1st, 2007, in a form of so-called OLED displays, organic light emitting devices, that are using these molecules to generate light emission. Beautiful light emission that actually surpasses the quality of any display you've ever seen. And in the long run, what we've shown in the lab is ability to reduce the power consumption of such a display by a factor of about 10 to 20 as compared to plasmas or LCDs. Indeed, as all of us are demanding larger and larger size screens, we are going to have a significant amount of more energy use, more electricity use on displays. We have to fix this. We have to come up with a more efficient technology and more deployable technology to enable the world. Well, if you actually scale the world for the energy consumption, this is a map of the world generated in the University of Michigan that shows here's the United States using a quarter of the world's energy. Here's Japan using quite a lot. There is Africa and its use of energy. Indeed, looking at the world and asking how much energy do we need, well, today we use anywhere, numbers in 2002 were 13.5 terawatts. Today it's about 16 terawatts. And if you all want to live at the intensity level of United States, well, we would need about 102 terawatts of energy. Indeed, a lot more energy than we are producing today. Now, living at the energy intensity level of United States indeed might not be the goal to strive for, but it is quite realistic that by 2050, we might expect the need for about 28 to 35 terawatts, about double to triple of what we produce today. That's a lot of new energy we need to make. And a new energy that is not obvious how it's going to come about. Well, the one thing we can certainly do is build more coal-burning power plants. We have many, many years of coal in ground in the United States. But the concern I have about that is what John was referring to. Global warming, indeed, is one of the phenomena that is, quite hard to control. I might find myself insignificant in trying to address that such a huge phenomenon. So I was thinking of ways to maybe make it a little bit more personal. Is there a way for me to convince you, if you're not already there, that, well, maybe it is a personal issue for you? And one thing that came to mind is that all of us breathe air, and it turns out these boreal forests up fairly far north produce 2/3 of our oxygen. Well, these boreal forests are dying off. They're dying off because the planet is getting warmer and the diseases that affect the trees are moving further and further north, killing off the trees. These trees, the only thing they ever had to protect them from the insects was the cold. They are not designed to actually fight the pest infestations. As a consequence of it, well, if we lose boreal forests, we lose 2/3 of our oxygen. That's not really good for us, right? That makes it a little bit more personal. The other good thing to cite is maybe this particular day, August 14, 2003. This is the nighttime sky of the New York City. Amazingly, actually, it's fairly dark. New York typically glows at night. And the reason why it was dark is because 256 power plants were offline due to a power failure. As a consequence of it, these guys were off. And the brilliance of the moment was the following day, 24 hours later, a professor from the University of Maryland decided to fly an airplane over New York City and collect the air samples. He found that in the matter of 24 hours of turning 256 power plants, the air in New York was better. The sulfur dioxide was down. This is what smog comes from, by 90%. Ozone, again, fairly bad for your lungs, was down by 50%. Light scattering particles, particulates in the air, were down by 70%. Well, we do know, again, statistically, there is an increase of airborne diseases in a country. So is this it? Is this the reason why? Certainly is a possible place where the diseases might come from. And consequently, again, maybe I can make it a little bit more personal. Let's come up with a way to reduce the generation of energy via polluting energy sources. And hence, I look at what do we do today in order to figure out where do we need to be. The one thing to do is simply look at a map of our energy use. There is a lot of oil, coal, and gas as a function of year here from 1965 to 2005. Nuclear and hydro are fairly small, and solar not even mentioned over there. Yet there is this thing called the first law of thermodynamics. You might have heard it in the form of energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It can only change the form. So I look at what energy forms do we have. Well, the one that actually is quite prevalent is the solar energy. That's how much energy sun gives us every year, and this is how much we consume every year. The ratio of the two is 1 to 10,000. Now, just as a rule of thumb, there are about 10,000 hours in 1 year. So if in 1 hour of a year, I'm able to capture every photon that shines on planet Earth and convert it with 100% efficiency into energy that I might use in the form of motion or electricity, In that 1 hour, I will capture all the energy that I need to run the entire planet for 1 year. That's a lot of energy. And I will certainly allow myself to have 1 extra night hour in order to capture all that energy if I could do it. Indeed, it gives me a chance to say, well, this is the way to go. This is one of those things I can think about of harvesting. Other things I can think about maybe harvesting would be maybe to slow down the moon, right? The tides. But the solar certainly is the more obvious way to go. Solar is what produces wind, right? It also is what, at the end of the day, is the source of those fossil fuels that we are so rapidly consuming today. So if I can do a solar consumption, if I can actually capture the solar and the wind, where would it bring me? Well, maybe what I can do is build homes that are indeed self-sustaining energy-wise. This is not necessarily that surprising. We have done similar types of revolutions in the past. Look at the evolution of computers from big mainframes to personalized computers, from centralized to distributed computing. Well, can we go ahead and move from centralized power generation to distributed power generation, where I can imagine having maybe a wind turbine, maybe a set of solar panels, maybe a way to extract heat from the earth via geothermal energy, and then be able to use that energy to generate, well, electricity, or maybe generate fuel that I might choose to store in underground tanks. What kind of fuel am I talking about? Well, there are a variety of things that you might imagine. And indeed, MIT is addressing all of these issues. So let me show you some of the teams. I'm not going to go into the science of how we do these things. I'll allude to it, and I'll gladly discuss with you afterwards in a question-answer session any specific technology you want to know more about. But there are many projects that MIT has embarked upon in their solar research. Works, for example, of Mark Boldo and colleagues on how to make solar concentrators. This is a way of taking plastic sheets and replacing silicon solar cells largely with these plastic sheets. Silicon will still be needed to be attached around the edge of these plastic sheets to collect the wave-guided edge-emitted light, but the amount of silicon would be reduced maybe by a factor of 100. In principle, tomorrow we can reduce the cost of silicon production or PV cell production by a very, very large amount, maybe a factor of 10, implementing these types of technologies. There is also the way of building the solar structure from ground up, using these nanomaterials, akin to the way that we can make light-emitting devices that are today commercial. We can just reverse a light-emitting device into a solar cell. A light-emitting device takes electricity and gives you photons. A solar cell takes the photons and gives you electricity. The basic physics is a little bit different, but the way to manipulate the nanoscale we now have at hand. We have developed over the past decade and a half way to make large area nanotechnologies that we're now ready to deploy and employ in development of new solar events. There is a great deal of effort in understanding how to better what is already at hand. Teams led by Tonio Buonassisi, Ellie Sachs, are looking at ways of using today's silicon technology and making it better. We have silicon already. How far can we push it to make it a more reliable and more widely deployable technology? How do we manufacture it? If we go ahead and then do generate a lot of electricity, we better come up with a way to store it, because sun doesn't shine at night, and yet we do need electricity at night. So can we go ahead and imagine ways of making better batteries? Indeed, there's a lot of work in generating designer materials, led by Gert Cedar, Don Sadoway, in understanding how to make better batteries. And then there's also a lot of very innovative work led by Dan Osera on coming up with ways of, well, taking solar energy and directly causing water, for example, to split into hydrogen and oxygen. That's kind of neat. I start with a cup of water, I generate oxygen and hydrogen, then I can then recombine to come up with a cup of clean water. It's a battery, in a way, a fuel cell, that is able to take a sun's energy and convert it into the chemical energy of storage as needed that can be then used at will.
Okay, I need a clicker for here. Okay. Professor Sterman, thank you very much. Am I on the speakers? I'm on the speakers. And I'm just waiting for some slides to come up. So in the light of all of this, the question is for me, and I think for many of you, what is a company to do? What's a corporation to do? Maybe you're not in the energy business. What can we do as a company to take action within this context and make a change? I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the things that BT has done some of the things we have done as a company, but we're a big company, and big companies can have lots of long lists of things that they've done, and the bigger you are, the longer your list can be. So I'm also going to spend a little bit of time talking to you about what can we do going forward to ensure we're not just presenting long lists of things, but that we are actually contributing towards solving the problem. I work for BT. I'm just waiting for a slide to come up. They're up? Oh, they're up there. Great, thanks. We are a telco. We sell IT and communications integration services to global multinational companies globally, and we are the incumbent provider in the UK. And as John said, I look after social responsibility for BT in North America. This is just a quick look at some of our awards. I'm not going to go through them all. The only one I want to mention is the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. We are the sector super leader in the telecom sector and have been for the last 8 years. We're very proud of that. We're also very pleased that many of the other companies in that sector are hot on our heels and are closing the gap. And that's, I think, a very good sign for the industry as a whole. This slide shows you, I'm going to focus mostly on our direct carbon footprint. But before I do that, I just want to give you a feel for the scope of activities that I think a corporation should be thinking about when they're taking action in the climate change space. And in fact, I think this same framework can apply in most, if not all, areas of sustainability. That ring in the middle that you see is direct footprint. So in terms of carbon, that would be the direct carbon emissions of our activities due to our energy consumption as a company, that is energy we pay to use, and the carbon emissions that are due to that. The ring surrounding that, the indirect emissions, that reflects the products and services we sell to our customers that are now in the hands of our customer. So that, in our case, might be a telephone, it might be a router, it might be a modem. The customer's got it on their premise, the customer's paying for the energy usage, so it's not our direct footprint, but we are very much complicit in that footprint because we designed that product and we set it up to be used the way it's used. The customer impacts it as well. If you're selling the customer a car, the footprint is partly about how they put their foot on the accelerator, but it's also about how you design the car. So those are the first two. In the case of telecoms companies, I would say our indirect footprint is probably a similar order of magnitude, maybe a little more than our direct footprint. In the case of a car company, Ford, happen to know because it's in their CSR report, their direct footprint is 8 million tons. Their indirect footprint is about 400 million tons of emissions. So as a company, you need to look at what is material to your operation, which of these areas. The third ring in here, the enabled impact. So for us, a motherhood and apple pie example of enabled impact is using conferencing, using teleconferencing, instead of traveling to a meeting. Okay? And so that's not the emission of our product, but our product goes out there into the marketplace and has the opportunity to reduce, or in some cases increase, the emissions of our customers in a different area of their business. For that, for us, in the ICT, the information communications technology world, that is a very material area. Estimates are that our enabled impact to reduce the emissions of the world around us are between 5 and 15 times as much as our direct footprint as an industry. So that is a very material area. And then the fourth ring in there, the opportunity to inform and influence the society around you. Clearly for a company with a significant brand name, that's a very important area. And for a media company, that's also a very important area. But although I've highlighted these other areas in which companies can have an impact, none of that, do we believe, relinquishes us of the responsibility to reduce our own direct carbon footprint, not least of all because that's what gives us the license to take action in those other areas, those concentric rings. So our direct footprint looks like this. We started measuring it in 1992. It took us about 4 years to really get our arms around it. So we baselined our footprint in 1996, at which time it was 1.6 million tons. Since then, we've reduced it by 58%, just short of 60%, to 0.6 million tons. That's our direct footprint. And this is without buying offsets. This is actual reduction of our direct carbon footprint. And we have an objective to reduce it by 80% on that 1996 baseline by 2016. A sort of a quick overview of how did we achieve that 60% reduction so far in 3 areas. First of all, in changing our business processes. So that, for example, would include substituting services instead of transport, or replacing a transport service, our service engineers driving around with an online service to provide the same service. Reducing paper usage, changing paper billing to internet-based billing. Reducing our real estate by creating a much more agile workforce so people don't rely on having a space, an office, and a desk, but are able to work in a much more agile manner. Changing our business processes is the first way. Secondly is efficiency, predominantly efficiency of devices. Data centers are generally considered to be about 1.5% of global carbon emissions. Changing the way we run our data centers, changing the efficiency, raising the operating temperature of a data center. Initially sounds counterintuitive, but it allows you to air condition less. Putting in energy efficient light bulbs, all of those things around the efficiency of the devices. And thirdly, renewable energy. We buy 0.7% of all the UK's electricity, but we buy 7% of all the UK's renewable electricity. About 5 years ago, we signed a 3-year renewable energy contract at the time the largest in the world, and 2 years ago we re-signed that 3-year deal. We're now about halfway through it. No longer the largest in the world, but still a very large renewable energy contract. But as you'll see from the title of this slide, this is BT's UK carbon footprint improvement. When we set this target in '96, of about the 170,000 people in the company, only about 1,000 were outside of the UK. We now have about 105,000 people in the company, and about 20,000 of them are outside the UK. So taking action on just our UK carbon footprint is no longer sufficient. And one of the things we needed to do was change that carbon footprint measure to incorporate, and that objective for the future, to incorporate our global activities. The second thing we wanted to do was build that into our financial activities as a company, so it was linked to our financial activities as a company. We also faced the challenge that outside of the UK, we are a very dynamic organization. 2.5, 3 years ago, we had 1,000 people in the US. We now have 4,000 people. So we needed to set up a carbon objective that allowed us to continue to grow as a business. That growth was predominantly acquisitions. So we weren't creating new carbon footprint. We were taking over a data center from a customer as part of an outsourcing deal, or we were acquiring the data center of a company that we together with that acquisition. So we needed to be able to take that growth on. We also wanted to be able to move away from a set of arbitrary numbers and relate what we were doing to solving the problem of climate change. A very bold thing to try and do, but we wanted to find a way of relating our carbon emissions to solving the problem. Thank you very much.
I think you can all see some of the exciting things that are happening right now today, and how what I particularly like about this is how tightly tied the goal for the company is to what needs to be done, their share of what needs to be done on the global basis. We have a few minutes, about 7 or 8 minutes, so we'll be delighted to take your questions and comments. We have some microphones down front, so if my colleagues would come over here, I think we can just sit, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Please, and come up to the microphone if you would.
Thank you very much. I'm Bonnie Nixon with HP. I have a question for BT. I wonder how you think, you mentioned that you're not in an energy intensive industry or environment, and I wonder how you think of your supply chain, given the fact that you use so many servers and things.
I still, relative to the intensity per unit of GDP, I think even looking at our supply chain and the equipment we use, although that's an important part of our footprint and it's one we take seriously, relative to the global intensity per unit of GDP compared to an aluminium smelter or something like that, I think we're still lower down, even including our suppliers. None of that relinquishes us of the responsibility to take it seriously and reduce it. Actually, though, the biggest proportion we feel of our services is the service in life, actually running our network, and once those devices get plugged in, the energy they consume still well outweighs the energy of manufacturing the piece of equipment from our perspective.
implement these programs, which I think all realize is a necessity, what kind of role do you see on the part of the government? Who is going to, you know, induce the public and industry to comply to these standards and so on?
Well, perhaps I can take a shot at that. I think it's an extraordinarily... Well, so I was just going to say it's an extraordinarily difficult and important question.
It's an important question in view of the role of the government in the overall economy and the state of our finances and so on, you know. Absolutely.
And I think it goes to the question of what is our model of change. And for me, and I articulated this, I don't think that the government is in a position to do very much until there is sufficient pressure from the grassroots level, from the business community, from individuals to take action. And that's why I made the analogy to the civil rights movement. It's only after there's sufficient pressure coming from the citizens and from the businesses that create the jobs, that provide the opportunities for our citizens, that government is going to take action. Now, we do need government to take action. We need all three of the key elements here. Maybe there are more, but business, the public, and government to be working collectively in a win-win fashion. So, for example, the price that we all pay for energy is currently not equal to, it's far below, the true cost of that energy we consume, because of the externalities of the environmental damage, the health effects, the security expenditures that we have to make in order to ensure our supplies of fossil fuels. If markets are going to function, those external costs have to be incorporated in prices. That's going to require a global agreement to raise carbon prices through cap and trade or some sort of a carbon tax. In order for government to get in the position where that's politically feasible, my personal view is the pressure for that has to come from the public and the business community, and that requires much broader understanding of the issues that you've heard about this morning, and much broader understanding of the opportunities, that it isn't actually going to be a burden and a drag on the economy, but is the way forward to create economic opportunity.
Well, I think the analogy with the civil rights movement, it didn't cost the individual any money. It was a political movement and political pressure. In that case, to implement these programs, it will need some individual sacrifices, and it's going to cost money to the individual and the industry and the government.
So I'm going to respectfully disagree. I think we are currently paying those costs now. We pay for it in the defense budget, in health expenditures, in reduced quality and length of life, and in many other ways. But you just don't pay for them at the pump. But we do pay those costs today. So in fact, it's really not going to be a cost. Yeah.
Yes, Jim Mann, Sloan Fellow, 2003. I took your class back then, 1993. My question is really, I work at the U.S. Navy headquarters in Washington, D.C. The system thinking, system dynamic thinking is simply absolutely absent. It's completely governed by the short-term focus and also political gains. And I think the fundamental route to solve this problem really relies upon instilling the system dynamic thinking, especially at the policy makers level. And I was amazed by the picture that Professor Bolovic showed. The lifetime picture of the world, India is as bright as America. And the India's size of brightness is as large as China. And I think the fundamental approach I would advocate to take is that the instilling the system dynamic thinking in India and China. It goes back to the root charter of the MIT institution. How do we establish system dynamic thinking in those two large masses that are coming up? You know, is there a way that you can have a MIT branch in India and China to really promote the basic system dynamic thinking, because ultimately, once the people are in power, has that kind of basic understanding, and this type of problem can be solved. That's all.
Very nicely said, and I certainly agree. So thank you very much. And we're working on it. And you should talk to Lester Thoreau, who's helping us get those ideas out there into East Asia, for example. Thank you.